When the United States began regaining its economic strength, a deeper question emerged, one that had been circulating quietly among diplomats, analysts, and world leaders for years. If America was recovering at home, would it also rise again abroad? For decades, the nation had carried the weight of global leadership, military alliances, trade agreements, peacekeeping missions, financial support, and diplomatic negotiations. But many Americans felt that while the U.S. was giving, the world was not always giving back. And on the international stage, rivals, especially China, were becoming more assertive, more ambitious, and more willing to challenge American dominance. As the economy strengthened under Donald Trump, the next phase of America's return was now unavoidable, redefining America's power in a changing world. It would be loud, it would be controversial, and it would be unlike anything modern foreign policy experts had seen in decades. The shift begins. From the moment Donald Trump moved into the White House, he challenged long-standing assumptions about America's role on the global stage. His philosophy was direct, blunt, and unapologetic. If the United States is the strongest country in the world, it should stop acting like it owes the world something. For decades, American presidents had approached foreign policy with caution, balancing diplomacy, compromise, and multilateral cooperation. The idea was to maintain stability, keep the peace, and strengthen alliances. Trump rejected that model entirely. His approach was based on leverage, economic, diplomatic, and military. To him, strength was not something to hide behind polite language. Strength was something to use. This shift became obvious in his interactions with America's oldest allies. The NATO demand. For years, presidents had quietly asked NATO countries to increase their defense spending. These allies had agreed in theory, but often failed to act in practice. American taxpayers carried much of the financial burden for Europe's security. Trump was the first president to confront the issue openly, forcefully, and repeatedly. He looked directly at European leaders and said, "If you want America's protection, you need to contribute your fair share." Many were shocked. Some were angered. But the reaction that mattered most was financial. Billions of dollars began flowing into NATO defense budgets. Countries that had ignored spending targets for years suddenly accelerated their investments, not because they were afraid of losing American support, but because, for the first time, the United States demanded accountability. It was one of the earliest signs that America was no longer willing to quietly absorb costs while others benefited. The world was changing, and so was America's posture. Confronting China directly. But the greatest shift, the one that would redefine global power, was America's stance on China. For years, China's rapid economic rise had reshaped global trade. Factories moved overseas, intellectual property was stolen, technology transfers were forced, and the U.S. trade deficit grew larger every year. Previous administrations recognized the problem but hesitated to act aggressively, fearing economic retaliation or diplomatic fallout. Donald Trump took the opposite path. He viewed the situation as unsustainable and dangerous. And so he did what no president before him had dared to do. He confronted China directly with tariffs, restrictions, and aggressive negotiations. Hundreds of billions of dollars worth of imports were targeted. For the first time in decades, China faced consequences rather than criticism. Economists around the world debated the strategy intensely. Some warned of escalation. Others argued the confrontation was decades overdue. But one outcome was undeniable. China came to the negotiating table. The Phase 1 trade deal was signed, addressing issues that had been ignored for years: protection of American intellectual property commitments to purchase U.S. goods, restrictions on forced tech transfers, adjustments to unfair trade practices. It wasn't a complete solution, but it was a turning point. For the first time, the United States had stepped out of the pattern of polite warnings and into a position of assertive leadership, and the world watched closely. A global message of strength. Trump's approach to global power was polarizing, admired by some, criticized by others, but one theme connected every action. America would negotiate from a position of strength, not weakness. Allies respected it, rivals acknowledged it, and the world adapted to a new reality. The United States was no longer predictable. It was assertive, sometimes aggressive, and always willing to defend its interests. Whether this style was the right one depended on who you asked. But the effect was undeniable. America's global presence had shifted. The nation was no longer simply participating in world affairs. It was leading them on its own terms. The new confidence at home. As foreign policy changed, something else was happening back inside the United States. Confidence. Not just economic confidence, not just market confidence, but personal confidence. People felt that the country was standing tall again. They felt protected. They felt acknowledged. They felt heard. In a world filled with rising global competition, America's return to assertive leadership resonated deeply with millions of citizens. They believed their country was not shrinking, not apologizing, not fading away. They believed it was becoming powerful again. And in many ways, that belief itself was transformative. A country repositioned by the time Donald Trump reached the third year of his presidency. The United States had undergone a dramatic shift. Stronger economy revived manufacturing, renewed job growth, rising wages, reshaped global trade, new peace agreements, a defeated terrorist organization, and a foreign policy driven by leverage rather than compromise. America was no longer playing the same role it had played for decades. It stood more firmly. It negotiated more aggressively. It acted more independently. And to millions of Americans, that change felt like something they had been waiting for. A sense of national strength, of momentum, of forward motion. It was not just about policies. It was about identity, America's identity. And so, the story continues. Part 3 marks the midpoint in this story, the moment when America's resurgence moved beyond its borders and began reshaping the world around it. But the journey is far from over, because the next stage, the one where momentum meets resistance, where success meets challenge, where America's comeback faces true tests, is coming. And that will lead us directly into Part 4. The Middle East Surprise. While global tensions rose, another unexpected shift unfolded, this time in the Middle East. For decades, the region had been dominated by conflict, mistrust, and deep political divides. Peace seemed unreachable, and previous attempts had collapsed under the weight of long-standing tensions. But something historic happened. The Abraham Accords. Nations that had never recognized Israel, that had lived in a state of hostility for generations, began normalizing relations. The United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Sudan, and Morocco all signed agreements that reshaped the region's political landscape. Commercial flights opened, tourism began, trade discussions started, diplomatic ties formed. Middle Eastern experts were stunned, world leaders took notice, and historians observed that a political breakthrough had occurred where almost no one expected one. For the first time in decades, the Middle East was showing signs of stability, and this shift had emerged during Donald Trump's first term. The defeat of ISIS. At the same time, the battle against ISIS, once the most feared terrorist organization in the world, entered its final stage. While the fight had begun before Trump took office, his administration accelerated operations. Combat restrictions were loosened. Military commanders were granted more flexibility. Within months, ISIS lost city after city. Their territory collapsed. Their so-called caliphate dissolved. The world was no longer watching ISIS expand. It was watching them fall. The symbolic moment came when their leader, the figure who once spread terror across continents, was eliminated in a U.S. Special Forces raid. Internationally, the message was clear. The United States was no longer playing defense. It was taking the offensive.